you so much for being here today. We're especially excited for today's panel. We have 4 really terrific speakers today and hope to have an engaging discussion around the key challenges facing developing countries today and the role of USAID, along with just more broadly international organizations, to help facilitate growth and reduce inequality and help with development worldwide. So before we begin, I'd like to introduce our 4 speakers on the panel. So first we have Erin Collinson. Erin is the Director of Policy Outreach at the Center for Global Development. Prior to joining the Center for Global Development staff, she spent over 5 years working for the US Senate. Second, we have our very own Director of the Center for International Development, Asim Khwaja, here at the Kennedy School and the Professor of International Finance and Development. Asim helped co-found the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan, CERP. And his own research focuses on lots of different things, but he's really extremely well known for his work on education and particularly the role of private schools and how they function in educational markets. Third, somebody who really needs no introduction is Dani Roderick. Dani is the Professor of International Political Economy here at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's widely published in the areas of international economics, and political economy. A lot of his current research focuses on economic growth, on issues about how to create good jobs, and on how to reduce inequality. Last but not least, we are very lucky to have with us today Sarah Rose. Sarah is a policy fellow here at the Center for Global Development. Her work as part of the Center for Global Development's U.S. Development Policy Initiative focus on U.S. government's aid effectiveness. Areas of research and analysis include the U.S. development policy in fragile states, the use of evaluation and evidence to inform programming and policy, the implementation of country ownership principles, and the policies and operation of the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the aid transition processes. Previously, Sarah worked for both USAID and MCC. So thank you guys for all being here today. We're so honored that you agreed to do this. I know myself, I'm very excited for today's panel. So great, I'm gonna start. We're just gonna dive right in because I know everybody's really looking forward to hear from all of you. And I'm gonna start today's panel by going around and asking you all the same question to start, to provide a little background on today's discussion topic, and share in your view, what are some of the biggest challenges facing developing countries today? And so I might start by going around on the screen and maybe start with Erin.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for having me. As Dr. Hanna indicated, I'm Director of Policy Outreach at the Center for Global Development. We're a nonpartisan think tank. My colleagues produce rigorous research and analysis on a range of development topics, including thinking about how development effectiveness can be improved at U.S. agencies. And Sarah will get more into that. But part of our mission is really about informing development policy. So my job is kind of thinking about how we can best engage in the policy debates and in some cases drive new ones. And ensuring that CGD work is relevant and accessible to decision makers, particularly in Washington. And it was also mentioned, I spent the early part of my career working on Capitol Hill. So I bring some insight into that part of the policy world. And I think we'll try to raise some of those issues in our conversation. In terms of biggest challenges facing developing countries, I think certainly in the near term, bringing the COVID-19 pandemic under control has to be a priority and is a precursor to economic recovery. But I think both will be rife with challenges, and meanwhile, we're increasingly seeing the effects of climate change around the world.
Great, thank you. I think Asim, you're next on my screen, so I'll turn to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rema, for the event and for the participants and for the audience as well. I just wanted to kind of take out aware from Erin. I wanted to echo what Erin said, but also kind of talk a bit about, how we're viewing. I mean, obviously, none of us can not face the current pandemic, and that's weighs heavy on all of our minds. I do want to kind of, perhaps, I wouldn't call this necessarily a positive spin, but perhaps a bit more ray of sunshine in thinking about this. So clearly a lot of countries will need to worry both about the health consequences, and at the moment it's like vaccine distribution, but obviously dealing with the health consequences of where we have arrived at. And the loss in educational outcomes, businesses, macro policy. So there's going to be a whole bunch of issues which we are thinking are dips in the growth process or the prosperity process. And I know there's a narrative around How are we going to recover? How are we going to get back? But there's also a narrative, not to be too political about it, kind of building back better. Not to be slogany about it, but I think there are things we have learned. I always feel like, I work in sectors where change is often, hard to bring about, both education and finance. We think we're innovative, but we really aren't. We really have been rehashing the same old for a long time. And I do think you need sometimes a moment of crisis or a moment of shock to bring that incumbency, if you will, into a more action-oriented strategy. And for me, there are silver linings I see. And I work in education, as you said, Rema, and in finance. And both of these areas, being in a virtual world, just the event we're happening right now and the events we've taken part of, these are powerful ways of increasing accessibility. I think the issue in education and finance has always been bringing quality in an accessible way to people, especially those most in need. The pandemic is going to make those needs even more stark. It's going to make inequality worse. But it also is giving us clues. As much as it's hurt us, it's giving us clues on how it can help us. And I think for me, it's really important that, especially multilateral organizations, and I would put USAID in the same bucket, is it's upon us. It's incumbent upon us to not just fall into the let's try to get back to where we were kind of narrative, but really push innovation at a time when I think there is an appetite for innovation. And I think organizations like the larger players can make that safer. It can create an ecosystem where we allow people to kind of take some of these new ideas they've brought out and follow on finance them, follow on support them, right? Get them to scale up in a way that they could be meaningful. So for me, that's an exciting pivot, if you will. There's a real danger that gets lost in obviously the hard work that needs to be done to recover.
Great, thank you, awesome. And so Sarah, I'm posing the same question to you next about some of the background on today's discussion topic, and in your views, what are the biggest challenges facing developing countries today?
Sure, absolutely. And again, I just want to thank the Center for International Development for the opportunity to have this time with you all today. And I'm also looking forward to the discussion and from hearing from the other panelists as well. This is a big question, and I think, there are some overarching answers that are possible. And I think one of the things that I will point to is not necessarily my own opinions on what are the biggest challenges, but those of the United States government in particular, that they see as the biggest challenges right now, and sort of where we are seeing sort of overtures of the Biden administration towards certain priorities in development. And you can harken back to Samantha Power's confirmation hearing that happened last week. She has been nominated to be administrator of USAID. And if she is confirmed, then she has outlined that USAID would continue to focus on sort of its major issues, including food security, global health, education, women's economic empowerment. And then she sort of framed the big challenges that these will all be sort of in the context of, and those include things thinking about COVID, of course, the pandemic, which touches everything, not only the health aspects as others have mentioned, but its impact on lives and livelihoods more broadly. How climate change affects these, thinking about the conflict dynamics that exist around the world in places like Ethiopia, Yemen, Northern Triangle, Syria, and also an issue related to democratic backsliding and how you're thinking about governance issues across the United States. And so, from the perspective of the US government, those are sort of the clues that we are getting, that those will be some of the biggest challenges that they will seek to help developing countries address. But more broadly, I think that it may be important to point out, and of course, this is the point that Dani Rodrik has made, throughout his career, is that development challenges are, of course, particular to countries and even localities within countries. And so, while I think it's interesting that the US approach has often sort of reflected the question posed here, what are the biggest challenges to development and how are we going to think about addressing those? I think that stands in contrast somewhat to sort of a more country-centered approach that asks, what are the particular constraints that this country faces? The pandemic is affecting countries differently. Climate change will certainly impact countries differently. Democratic backsliding looks different in different kinds of countries. And so I'm departing a little bit from the key question, but I think it is, worth highlighting that, USAID in particular has under the last administration started to think about how an approach could look that would sort of, what they always said, sort of meet countries where they're at in terms of thinking about country-specific needs for addressing their development constraints to being able to plan, finance, and manage development. Of course, these are constrained by sort of broader systemic things that are imposed upon the agency in terms of funding by Congress, et cetera. But I think I agree exactly with the points that my colleagues on the panel have made today in terms of the broader development challenges. But I think almost more important than that is thinking about how do you ascertain what the key development challenges of a particular country are, and what is the process that you use to try to diagnose that. We'll go into that a little bit more later.
Great, thank you. I completely agree with you, and I'm hoping we can pick up on that in a bit and talk more about that. But I'd like to turn it over to Dani next with the same question.
Thank you, Rema. It's very nice to be on this panel. I'm old enough by some distance compared to the other panelists to remember when the conversation about development was actually very, very different. It was really about failure. And when I started out my career, of course, there were a few East Asian countries that were doing well, but for the bulk of developing countries were actually sort of were failing, and sub-Saharan Africa was, as the term then went, the basket case, and the field was full of theories as to how Africa could never develop. And then I was lucky enough in my career to see that conversation change very rapidly. Actually, after the 1990s, of course, China was a big turnaround, but it wasn't just China. China is, of course, since it housed so many of the world's poor, but even in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen significant gains in poverty reduction, in advances in education, in health after the AIDS crisis, and in governance, in the spread of democracy in the continent. So before COVID struck, there was actually a lot of things that were going on a positive trend in low and middle income countries. And now the question is, has COVID changed all of that? I view COVID much more as an accelerator and something that is deepening the trends and tensions that were already existing in the world. So I think it makes us see a little bit more clearly some of the problems that existed in the previous world, which actually was moving in the right direction, but in some ways, not in an altogether sustainable kind of way. And I think that's why I think Asim's point is very important, that as we think about the process of recovery in the developing world, that we actually think about not trying to resuscitate policies and approaches and strategies that seem to be doing okay, but instead are adapting them to the actual reality. So why do I think that it was, things were unsustainable? Well, I think we on the governance front, certainly we were seeing very big changes and indicators of deterioration, that we were sort of certainly experiencing a decline in democracy. I think even in countries in sub-Saharan Africa for very long periods of time had managed to contain ethnic strife. There was increasing sense that was going to become more of a problem because of many of the kinds of economic and social dislocations that actually came from many people in these countries getting connected to the world economy, benefiting from globalization, and this kind of productive dualism and economic dualism being aggravated in many of these countries actually also drove them apart. And as in the West, as in the United States, in Europe, I think it gave a platform for political movements, politicians, to actually inflame ethnic and racial and linguistic divisions. I think the whole growth model was unsustainable, because if we look at sort of what was happening in many sub-Saharan African low-income countries, it wasn't really driven by a kind of a productive transformation of more and more people getting into higher paying, more productive jobs in manufacturing. It was a kind of we can go into the details later if you want, but it was more of a demand-driven and unsustainable, and we're already seeing that with the fall off in growth in India and decline in growth in many of the African countries. And I think the whole sort of the global picture, of course, is changing. The whole geopolitical environment with the rise of China. One consequence of that was the whole world order was being rewritten, and that we're not going to go back to the kind of the U.S. or the Western Europe-led world order that we had before. And what does that mean for development? It's entirely clear. I think the greatest challenge, actually, we're talking about challenges for development, the greatest challenge for US economic development policy is going to be to prevent it from its being driven by the rivalry with China. Because I think for everything that USAID wants to do in the area of gender equality and access to water and health and so forth, I think the big issues are going to be driven by US foreign policy. And I think in its attempt to, I mean, you know, just to give an example, Huawei is a company that provides a lot of important telecommunication services in Africa, that has made access to cheap telephony possible in the continent. But if we were, you know, the U.S. You know, believes Huawei is an enemy and wants to fight, you know, wants to get every country in the world on board with keeping Huawei out. I understand the national security debate, but if that whole issue about the presence of, you know, China in Africa is going to be viewed from the perspective of national security and U.S. foreign policy goals, leaving even aside whether that is legitimate or not, I think it's going to have a much bigger and much more adverse impact on development potential than what the development, you know, professionals themselves will be able to achieve. But so let me just stop here, and I'm sure we'll get into some of the details in the discussion.
No, thank you. I think, you know, for me, a lot of the topics you raise are extremely important. Like on one hand, I know there's been a lot of, while there's been a ray of light in the US, we've started to see vaccines taking hold in a lot of developing and emerging countries worldwide. They're thick in the COVID crisis right now. But I also agree with Asim and Dani that there are positive trends before in the past that give us hope for the future. And then also this idea that there's also an optimism that, you know, there is an appetite for something new. There's an appetite for new ideas to address some of the problems that are becoming more stark. And I do, and I part of the discussion I want to have today is then what is the role of USAID and multilateral organizations more broadly in terms of helping drive forward these discussions and thinking through them. And particularly for a lot of our students who are on the line and hope to be more engaged with these organizations in their professional careers, what they should be thinking about as we're moving forward. And so before I start, I have a series of questions to start getting into the details, as Dani said. Before I do, I just wanted to note, so I have a few questions that I was going to pose to the panel that I'm really excited to hear their answers on. But Sarah is manning the chat, and if you put your questions into the chat, she's going to organize and pull out some of the questions for me to also raise after mine. And so don't be shy. We want to hear from you. And so feel free to put your questions in the chat. Great. So I think I'm going to then start. I know Dani just spoke, but I'm going to start with you again. You talked a little bit about the idea of the challenges USAID is going to have in terms of, you know, both its relationship with other countries and particularly with China, which is a major player in both, you know, the world's economy, but also in the development space more broadly, not just in Asia, but also in Africa and Latin America and other countries these days. And so I want to start with you and ask more broadly about, you know, given all of the changes we've seen and, you know, your long history in development, how do you view the role of international organizations more broadly in this new world?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think, you know, we all start out with a disadvantage, and I think aid agencies and international organizations start with an even greater disadvantage because of, you know, their need to have something to hold on to. And I think what I'm referring to here as a disadvantage is a dissolution of a certain kind of consensus about what development policy entailed. And I think, you know, that happened really with the, you know, first, you know, the erosion of the the Washington Consensus, which was largely about sort of policies at the sort of macroeconomic level, economy-wide policies. And I think the Washington Consensus has already lost its appeal, and I don't know anybody who thinks that the Washington Consensus is the way to go. But that sort of then later, I think, was overtaken by an agenda of sort of micro or sectoral interventions, driven by, sort of RCTs and evidence at the local level, and I think that has certainly has had a lot of successes. But I think the disadvantage is how do you proceed when you don't have a sort of a vision, an underlying story about how to make development happen? Now, you might think that development happens, one project at a time, and I think that's okay. But I think it needs to be in terms of setting your priorities, in terms of your relationship with governments and setting an agenda. You have to have a sense of how development is going to happen, so you can leverage your resources and to position yourself appropriately. Now, if we are, as I suggested in my initial set of comments, in a really very different world, not just because of COVID aggravates the differences. We're in a different world because the world is fracturing, the whole global economy is fracturing in a way that is becoming increasingly evident, so that a strategy that is simply, let's say, focusing on opening up your economy to the global economy and getting on the hyper-globalization bandwagon is not going to work. In a world where technological trends are in many ways actually quite adverse to developing countries, because they tend to undermine developing countries' fundamental comparative advantage in labor-intensive commodities, because they favor more capital-intensive, more skill-intensive technologies. So if you're in a world like that, what happens to the traditional model of industrialization and promoting investment in industrial projects and investing in infrastructure for manufacturing and industry and so forth? If the potency of industrialization is being undermined by these new technological trends. And then how do you address the kinds of increasing domestic social and spatial conflicts that are driven by this deepening productive dualism, even in developing countries? Because in every developing country, there's some sectors that are not thoroughly integrated in the global economy, are operating at productivity levels that are very, sort of close to the frontier levels, while, the bulk of the economy is falling further behind. And that, I think, is the root of many of the weakening of the governance issues and the exacerbation of the governance issues in many of these countries. How do you address inclusion in that kind of a setting? So we don't have new, we don't have an overarching story in this new environment about how to handle these problems. I don't think it's the job of international organization or bilateral aid agencies to develop this story. I think the story will have to be developed by partner governments. So I think in terms of, I think we need to give partner countries and their governments the room to develop that story, because too often they look, as you know, on to the World Bank to come up with this strategy, or the bilateral donors to say, well, what do you want us to do? What should be our priority so you can fund? So there has to be that mutual respect, that room for, but I think it's really a much more a much more difficult environment. I mean, one of the first things that I tell our students when they come into the development program is, we want to try to teach you not what to think, but how to think, and hopefully, we do a little bit of that. But I think this is the kind of environment really that is really very important, that we need the tools of how to think. And I think what to think is much more uncertain than it has been for a long time.
Oh, Thank you, Dani. I want to turn this over to Asim. I think, Dani raised a number of important points of that in many ways, the pandemic is just laying bare all of the challenges that we've been seeing. As there's been growth in many countries, it's also been leading to increasing inequality. The types of jobs that we're seeing are not necessarily the jobs, not necessarily good jobs, and that the governance issues, at least for me, I feel like in many ways I'm less hopeful now about a lot of the governance issues than I was when I was a kid, and I saw them going in a very different direction. And so in some sense, and again, and I also agree with Dani in the sense that I don't think necessarily the story should be coming from the development agencies, but rather we should be thinking about our relationship with different partner governments and how do we facilitate broader links and development more broadly. And so I'd love your views on all of this as well. How do you think the pandemic and what you've seen in the last year changes some of the ways we think about development and the role of these international organizations?
Thanks. I guess for me, there's the good news and the bad news. Let me start with the bad, maybe. The bad to me is I find development institutions, the way they're constructed right now, not effective, and I don't see them being effective. If our premise on these organizations was that they're either the bringers of money, the bringers of knowledge, or the bringers of consensus, I think those ships have sailed a long time ago. They're just trivial when it comes to money. There's enough private sector money flowing in these places that whatever World Bank or IMF or USAID or DFID or FCDO can put together is just chump change. I'm sorry to say it that way, but it just isn't. So I think in terms of knowledge, I think it used to be the case, but I want to kind of echo what Sarah and Dani said, which is I don't think the production of knowledge, even if we thought that it's constrained to these organizations, is the right or is the exclusive set of knowledge we need. I think you need much more local knowledge generation. And I would actually argue, I'm not a fan of country unit either. I think that's too large. I find countries to be, I want to go much lower. I want to go lower at the level of regions, sub-regions, locales, cities, towns, communities, individuals. Because I think actually countries get mired in the same politics Dani talked about between US and China. And so, I don't find that a useful construct, to be honest. I understand politically we need it, but at least in policy, I think even lower. The analogy for me, and then the question becomes, okay, so then if these three things, and convening, I think, with the world of crowdsource ideas and stuff, I don't think we need a gathering in Washington or Switzerland for us to figure out what we need to be working on. I think those are also relics of how we used to do things. I think the good news to me is, look, there are success stories of how you can you create a centrally organized structure which allows for decentralized response and innovation to happen? I think that's an interesting question for me. And I think the analogy which has worked is in the tech space. Take any platform. And my sense is what we need international organizations to start doing is thinking about, do they have a platform play? And in a platform play, I think, to me, there's no yes or no. I think that's the only play. The question is, which kind of platform do you create? Do you create like an Apple OS, iOS kind of platform where it's regulated and only high quality people can come in? Or do you go in an Android type space where there's a Wild West and whoever wants to come up with their idea can flourish and thrive? I really think that's the real debate. And I would love to see international organizations beginning to take that on very, very seriously, which has some deep issues about data, privacy, technology, access. I mean, the Huawei issue that Dani mentioned touches on all of those. I think that's the enabling infrastructure that we need to help large organizations create. I mean, we had Alex Duane a couple of weeks ago talking to us about what GIF is doing or what USAID Div is doing. And I think thinking of those structures and making them more at meta scale and divvying that kind of responsibilities up, that to me sounds very exciting, right? But there's some real, I'm not saying there isn't a role for a central coordinator or regulator, absolutely, but as an enabler of this local innovation.
Great, thank you, Asim. Now, and I want to follow up on a little bit of what you said, that I do think, as Dani mentioned at the beginning of his talk, the world has changed. We've seen enormous growth over recent many years. And the role of foreign aid has very much changed. So other than the poorest countries in the world, which tend to be very war-torn, that are very dependent on foreign aid, if you look at most middle, lower middle, I hate these categories, little income countries, the amount of tax revenue being generated in these countries it just dwarfs any sort of foreign aid that's coming through. And so then it's a matter of how do we think about the international organization and their role? And I think the piece that everybody's been really talking about and debating about is knowledge generation, and how to get the right knowledge when we know that, knowledge, to get the right kind of knowledge generation and to set the right kind of questions and to think about the kind of data and transparency we need is also very specific to local contexts. And so that's actually a very nice segue and transition to the next topic I wanted to talk about, was the idea of thinking about evidence and data and transparency, as part of international aid agencies' role. And how do we think about this knowledge generation? And I know, in fact, the new Biden administration has already said they're prioritizing using evidence to inform policy even within the US. But I want to think a little bit more about this in terms of USAID moving forward. And so I'm going to turn this over to you, Erin, and what might be the challenges to accomplishing this for USAID or as a whole for development practitioners, this idea of bringing evidence into the policy debate.
Yeah, thanks. And I think this is a great discussion. And I think there's sort of the big trends and the big, how do we think about the role of international organizations? And I am really zooming in here to sort of the specifics of USAID and it exists, it's out there. What are we doing? How would we think about, as we at CGD, frankly, do a lot of trying to push the agency to pursue more evidence-based policies or commit to generating evidence through better data collection, evaluation, and transparent practices. And it feels like we're pushing on more of an open door these days, but I think it's worth thinking too about some of the real obstacles that stand in USAID's way that have the potential to undermine some of those objectives, even when I think the right motives are there. And allow, potentially also prevent USAID from functioning in some of the ways that we'd like to see. So, I'm not going to go through the full list here because there's quite a bit. And if you're interested in the really deep, weedier dive, there's actually a paper that CGD published back in 2010 from former USAID Administrator Andrew Natsios that goes into sort of vivid detail about a lot of these issues. But one fundamental point is just that USAID is subject to a lot of regulatory pressures. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but between legal provisions and guidance from the Office of Management and Budget and other forms of federal regulation, they're largely focused on this idea of guarding against waste, fraud, and abuse. And while I think those are things we would like to avoid, there's really an overemphasis, I think, in law and regulation, and maybe borrow phrasing from a colleague of ours, Charles Kenny, but on the receipts, so like the bookkeeping and procedural accountability rather than the results and the actual development outcomes that we hope to see. This has lots of consequences throughout the agency. It takes staff time away from other kinds of work. I think, to the point about sort of local knowledge, it really rules out local partners in a lot of places who don't necessarily have, the required processes or policies in place. And also really rules out a lot of direct government-to-government assistance in the vast majority of contexts. I think it slows money getting to the field to some extent and creates maybe a little bit more of a project orientation rather than some of the bigger thinking that was discussed. And, just generally kind of tends to make the agency a bit more risk averse. So, you really need leadership at the top pushing in the other direction, I think, to overcome some of these things. And I think Sarah's going to talk a little bit about this more. But then I'll just add, you kind of add Congress to the mix, right? And it's another layer. Congress shapes international assistance in the US in a few different ways. Sometimes it's through legislation, although admittedly the Foreign Assistance Act hasn't been rewritten or updated in a very long time. But the issue of Huawei and sort of Chinese technological infrastructure is brought up. And I think that's the kind of stuff where Congress has weighed in and said, we don't want to see this in some places. But more than that, and more often than not, it's through the appropriations process and then its oversight activities. And on the appropriations front, Congress determines USAID's budget on an annual basis. And I think that's a mixed bag, right? On the one hand, there's bipartisan support among lawmakers for foreign aid that essentially shielded the agency from major budget cuts that were sought by the Trump administration. So the last 4 years kind of were a reminder of how important some of that buy-in can be. But beyond top line figures, lawmakers have a habit of including lots of spending directives. So these can take the form, call them both hard and soft, depending on the language, but direct USAID to spend a certain amount of money in a particular region or country or sector or program, or sometimes all of those. Within global health, you have things like very disease specific allocations. So they really run the gamut. And again, maybe that gets you some buy-in from Congress, which can be useful to the agency, but it really limits USAID's flexibility, particularly with development assistance. Humanitarian assistance kind of operates differently, but to respond to evolving circumstances, or even allow for maybe sort of more country-specific needs or interests to be taken into account. They do what they can in that space, but from a starting point of having lots of different allocations that they need to meet, it makes it hard, and it makes it hard to plan. And then again, the fact that this occurs on an annual basis, often a delayed one, we know development to be a much longer term endeavor. And so that becomes hard to strategize around. And you also tend to see, Congress occasionally brings USAID officials up to the Hill to celebrate progress, but they're often doing it when they're unhappy about something, and there's a story about potential financial mismanagement or something. And so, I think that has the tendency to reinforce some of the risk aversion, and maybe discourages the real discussions about what has and hasn't worked, and how the agency can learn from those things. Maybe I'll leave it there.
No, thank you, Erin. You highlighted a number of important challenges. I want to turn it over to Sarah to talk more broadly. Given some of these types of challenges that we've been discussing, how can you think about USAID refining its processes to better achieve its development priorities?
Great, thanks. So, while Erin said she zoomed in, from the big picture discussion to talk about USAID's sort of position in the broader US, political economy and regulatory system, I'm going to zoom in even farther now to talk a little bit about sort of the agency context around, opportunities for incorporating evidence and challenges to doing so as well. And so, I think, as Erin pointed out, this big question about, what is development knowledge and what should we be seeking, and how should we think about doing it is obviously the key one. But again, as she pointed out, USAID does take a fairly programmatic kind of approach to development. And so there remains in some ways sort of this imperative to be able to understand, whether money is being spent in a way that achieves the objectives that USAID is setting out to do. And I think, I probably don't need to set out the reasons for that to this crowd, but, USAID is the world's largest bilateral donor. I mean, it has about $20 billion in annual funding. And so, in a way that gives it sort of this particular responsibility to sort of take this evidence-informed approach. And, it also has a congressional mandate to do so. And so I think it was in 2018, 19, Congress passed the Evidence-Based Policy Act. And so it really does call for agencies to do better in terms of thinking about, are they thinking about a strategy for evaluation? Are they thinking about, conducting evaluations to a particular level of quality? And are they using that information or that learning from evidence and evaluation to inform their own work? And so just to set the stage a little bit about sort of where USAID is on this. If you look across federal agencies, USAID actually gets a lot of credit for being, not bad, pretty good actually, in terms of how it thinks about evidence-based programming. This is done, I think it's an annual assessment by Results for America, and they tend to rate USAID pretty well. And part of this is because, under the Obama administration, the agency really reinvigorated its commitment to evidence-based programming and policymaking. And this was certainly championed by then Administrator Raj Shah. They established a new evaluation policy. They created the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning, and within that, a unit that was going to focus on learning, evaluation, and research. They launched Development Innovation Ventures, or DIV, which was co-founded by Nobel laureate Michael Kramer. And of course, this is this unit that seeks to sort of identify or seeks applications for innovative approaches to development challenges, and then takes this tiered approach to testing them, and then seeking to scale those with strong evidence of impact and cost effectiveness. So there have been a lot of steps forward over the past decade or so, but building a new culture of evaluation and learning actually takes a lot of time, and it takes consistent prioritization to be able to move things forward in a big bureaucracy that is, by its nature, somewhat resistant to change. And so, over the last 4 years, this wasn't as high of a priority under the Trump administration. I mean, it didn't squash evaluation, but again, it wasn't a priority. It was kind of been simmering, maybe to a degree on the back burner to some degree. So where are we right now with this? So, if you look at the last decade or so, what you can see is that, as a result of some of these early moves to be able to push, thinking about evaluating its own programs in a better kind of way, that Usaid has produced more and better quality evaluations. But evaluation quality remains mixed. So there have been a number of assessments of evaluation quality done over the last several years, and they find that a lot of them aren't all that well done, and a lot of them don't have findings that are terribly linked to the methodology, or they don't even choose methodologies that are appropriate. And then beyond that, impact evaluations in particular, which are those that would sort of assess results that might be attributable to a particular USAID program, have remained really rare. Now, I'm not of the camp that says, you should have an impact evaluation for everything. That's certainly not true. There's a number of reasons why you wouldn't choose to do an impact evaluation. Good performance evaluations can be equally important, but the fact that they are so rare suggests that there is a lot of scope to be able to expand efforts in this area. Taking that a little bit further, you look at the question of value for money, and while impact evaluations may be rare, impact evaluations that are costed and think about results per dollar remain rarer still. And yet this kind of information is precisely what might be important to think about how you think about opportunity costs and trade-offs, within a unit of USAID that is seeking to fund certain things. Can they ask the kinds of questions about, does this project work well enough to justify spending the money on it compared to using those funds for something else? Or, is a project per dollar impact, greater than that of an alternative? And so, USAID has started to tackle this kind of question with some interesting studies, but it remains very niche at this point. And so why is this the case? Like, what is the constraint, right? Again, I think, it takes time, again, to sort of build this bureaucratic culture of evaluation. But you think about, time constraints, capacity constraints of staff, staff are under pressure to execute programming. That is their main job. And so when you think about trying to structure a program that would build in an evaluation, there's a lot of incentive not to do so. And that's what they are not, that's not what they are being, professionally evaluated on doing. You also think about capacity too. They've done a lot of trainings about evaluation, but doing a 2-week training on what is an evaluation and why is that important doesn't necessarily lead to the skills that are necessary to be able to, design an evaluation scope of work, especially for some of the more sort of technically rigorous impact evaluations, and be able to procure that. So, even more important than sort of evaluation production, though, at USAID, I think, is evidence use. And I think this is also where you see sort of mixed performance at this point. And so, USAID doesn't necessarily have to use evaluations of its own work to try to inform future programming. There are evaluations that are being conducted all over the place by the World Bank, by the FCDO in the UK, former DFID, other organizations that are academics that are doing evaluations. But the question is the application of this body of evidence, applied to the kinds of programs that USAID seeks to pursue? And I think, it's very clear that that's mixed, right? It's inconsistent. And again, you look at time and capacity constraints on this. People who are charged with, running a procurement don't have time to perform a full lit review to try to understand what the evidence base is. There's been skepticism about relevance of evaluations. I mean, again, if a lot of USAID's evaluations in particular are of mixed quality, they might not be as useful. And then there's the big question too that I think was raised earlier about, sometimes USAID is spending money for other reasons. And so, these funds ostensibly are going to development purposes, but perhaps the real motivation for spending money in country X is for geostrategic purposes. And so maybe you don't really care that much about what the outcomes are when the outcomes are something other than the development outcomes that are associated with the program. And so, there's a couple of ways I feel like I'm going on too long here.
No, this is great.
How to approach this, and it's difficult and challenging, and there's not one silver bullet to doing this. But I think one of the ways that is sort of central to it is having someone who can be this high-level champion. And I think that we're seeing hope in this area, again, coming from the Biden administration. You noted that The Biden administration has put out sort of a White House memorandum that commits to evidence-based policymaking. Again, Samantha Power in her confirmation hearing, committed to using evidence to inform programming. And so, there are overtures at this point from high-level folks or folks who will be in high-level positions to sort of reprioritize this. It remains a little bit to be seen, sort of, what level of priority this might get, considering all the other, major high priority issues that are on the table, of course. But I think, the hope is that that they would be able to see this sort of evidence orientation as really underpinning the success of the other objectives they might seek to achieve in terms of addressing COVID and addressing democratic backsliding, conflict, et cetera. So, other things that might be important are, again, thinking about how you strengthen evaluation skills within USAID missions in particular, and whether that's, hiring people differently or having sort of, a larger cadre of sort of deployable resources that can really help missions be able to identify opportunities for evaluation and be able to help with the sort of the technical components of being able to, procure them and then manage them would be useful. And then another thing, this is sort of, a little bit in the weeds, but it's actually like really at the heart of what USAID does is using this procurement process. I mean, USAID is fundamentally a contracting agency. And so, they don't do things that they can't contract for. And so procurement matters enormously for what the agency ends up doing. And so to the extent that the agency could then be held accountable for using that procurement process to either ensure that sort of more prescriptive programs were fundamentally based on a body of evidence that might exist for the intervention that they want to pursue, would be important. And when there is not such a body of evidence, that procurement then should be accompanied by opportunities, if you will, should integrate opportunities for experimentation and testing. There's more things that I think would be important in terms of thinking about how do you think about an evaluation strategy for each sector that really prioritizes the key questions to try to get to use evaluation funds more strategically. And also, again, investing in faster, less expensive kinds of data sources and impact evaluation methods. And part of this is using sort of things like administrative data. Can you help think about how do you improve the quality of the data that countries themselves are collecting to be able to bring that to bear on the kinds of information that the agency might want to know. So I'll stop there.
No, this is great, Sarah. I have so many follow-up questions that I would want to ask you, but I know we're limited on time. And there's, and I also had questions more on my list, but I've noticed a few questions have come in from the audience. And so I do want to try to turn to some of the audience questions. And so the first one, Katrella Friedman asked me to ask the first question. And so this question is about the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the methodologies that the Millennium Challenge Corporation uses as opposed to USAID, and what do we think about their methodologies, and what have we learned from their policy approach? And so I think for many of the students in the room who might not know the differences between the two, I don't know if maybe Erin, you want to maybe comment a little bit more about how Millennium Challenge Corporation operates versus USAID and your thoughts, and then I might turn it over to Dani as well to talk about, given the Millennium Challenge Corporation focuses on so much of the growth diagnostics, that Dani pioneered as well, that I'd love to get him to comment afterwards as well. So I'm going to turn it over to you first, Erin.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to, but I would almost defer to Sarah because she actually had previously worked at MCC and has done a lot of work looking at the agency. So I suspect she can do an even better job at this.
Okay, then Sarah, I will turn it over to you for a little bit of a difference between the two.
Sorry, I'll try to keep it more brief. So MCC was set up in 2004, basically to do aid a little bit differently. I think recognizing some of the limitations of the USAID model. And so one of the things that MCC was set up purportedly to do is have one single objective. And so we talked about how USAID ends up struggling with this blend of objectives, geopolitical, along with sort of these development objectives. But MCC was founded to try to take that a little bit out of the equation. Now, it doesn't do so thoroughly, of course. It is a US government agency, but it largely does. And so it focuses exclusively on economic growth. And so it does design its programs, with that in mind. And so MCC doesn't have spending directives. Erin talked about this too. So USAID's budget is largely determined by Congress, and it spends money according to where Congress wants it to. MCC's, has sort of, doesn't have those directives imposed upon it, and has been able to follow a more sort of country-owned model in which the countries that MCC identifies as eligible for its funding would then, work together with MCC to try to identify sort of priority sectors and then priority interventions within them. And of course, as Rema mentioned, one of the key sort of analytical tools that MCC employs is based on Rodrik, Hausman, and Velasco's growth diagnostic model that looks at sort of the binding constraints to growth in order to sort of, put some sort of, some guardrails or constraints around the kinds of projects that a country might propose to ensure that they really would be indeed growth focused. With MCC, the partner country establishes sort of an operating unit that actually runs the program itself. And so it's not really run out of MCC in Washington, but it is run out of the unit within the country, and they run all the procurements, et cetera. And then MCC is also highly committed to evaluation and seeks to do rigorous evaluation for the vast majority of its compacts. And so those are sort of the model that's a little bit different than USAID's. And I think people largely look at the model as one of good process. If you look at MCC's evaluations, again, which they are very good at doing, and they are ahead of the curve in terms of thinking about how to sort of synthesize those for greater use, what you find is probably as expected if for those who know about development, is that it's kind of a mixed bag. Like some of these programs have moved the needle a little bit on economic growth, others haven't. And so I think that's, again, the process, I think, is widely commended in terms of MCC's sort of, broad impact on its goal of economic growth. Again, I think kind of mixed.
Oh, great. I'd like to turn it over to Dani as well, particularly to comment. I know there's been a lot of debate more broadly around the MCC about should their focus be on growth or inclusive growth, and I'd love to get a little bit of your views and lessons learned on that. Oops. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I think Sarah described it really very well, and there is not really much that I can add. I have not been following what MCC has been doing very, very recently. My understanding was that it was really motivated in the origins, and perhaps it was more of a kind of Republican kind of idea that really we should be focusing more on investment and growth rather than very bottom-up kind of development projects, which the USAID was more involved in. But my sense is that, I like a lot in the MCC approach that, as Sarah said, it is supposed to be country-driven, so that the priorities are supposed to be generated by the country. I like a lot that it takes a position that in terms of what are some of the key binding constraints to private investment and growth, and rather than spreading oneself too thinly and say these are the particular obstacles that we're going to be targeting. And so I like those things. The fact that it's supposed to be driven by the country. I like the fact that there is supposed to be a kind of, an ex ante filter, that you're supposed to pass certain governance criteria in order to be eligible, so that, in principle, these are countries where the government is not a cronyistic cabal that's not fundamentally interested in driving development and so forth. So I think there are a lot of the elements that in the design of the MCC, and I also gather that it operates perhaps, but this is more a question to Sarah and Erin, that it operates a little bit at greater arm's length from politics of U.S. government politics. And so in that way, it may be perhaps a little bit more professionalized in the way that it pursues its goal. I'm not so sure it's so far driven, that today it's necessarily that much driven just by, growth. I just looked at their website, it's growth and poverty reduction. So it seems like, as typically happens with organizations, that, it's sort of become more amorphous in terms of its objectives, which brings me to my question. I wonder if Erin or Sarah or anybody else who knows might answer. Is there anything that we can learn from the MCC experience that could be applied to USAID? Do we need two agencies? Maybe some competition isn't bad, but if we were to do, given how MCC operates today and how we've, what we've learned from it, if we were to start from a blank slate, would we really create two different agencies that are more or less doing the same thing?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if Erin or Sarah, one of you want to comment on that. I see Erin's already unmuted herself.
I would just maybe jump in because I think this does sort of follow from some of the points I raised, and then Sarah probably has other thoughts too. I mean, I think, one of the things we talk about when we talk about MCC is that, sort of more of the country ownership model. It's not sort of direct. There's a unit that's set up, but that's something that really isn't generally open to USAID because of some of the restrictions it's put under. Similarly, as Sarah mentioned, spending directives, the MCC doesn't have this, so it doesn't have to worry about, fitting in X dollars for education or whatever it is. They really look at, using that analysis and moving forward. And then the other thing is, the duration of the compact. So USAID has typically annual money. Occasionally things are offered for longer term, but it's that annual budget cycle. And that I think creates challenges to planning, and MCC benefits from the fact that when it does compacts, they're usually around 5 years.
Great. I know we have limited on time, so I want to try to get to a few more of the questions, even though I'd love to continue along this as well. I think there was a question directed to you, Asim. I think the idea of the platform was very intriguing to our listeners today. And so I think the question was really if you could talk about it a bit more, and how do you unpack what that platform model would look like?
Thanks, Rema. So I guess partly alluding to some of the comments my co-panelists made, you think of sort of core infrastructure you need to develop something like a platform. And so what are those core infrastructures you need? You need something which looks like a diagnostic tool. When the World Bank first started, one of the big contributions was developing things like living standard measurement surveys, the idea of household surveys and the power of household surveys. And that was a huge value addition in terms of information. I think Sarah alluded to this. I think, all of us have been guilty of designing 3-hour-long surveys and using 10% of that data. I think it's a really bad way of collecting data in today's world. It's directed, it's tedious, and it's not revealed preference data. It's self-reported data. I think there's a huge innovation waiting to happen on how do we take data that is floating in the ether and convert that into usable bytes for people who ask important questions. And whether that's a grand unification of thinking through CDR data, call data records, social media data, administrative data, census data. I mean, a couple of years back, Dani and Rema are familiar with this, I'd been involved in something called RISE-PAC, which is like disaster relief. And I'm still horrified that to this day, most countries have digitized censuses. We don't have a global disaster response database where if a disaster hits, immediately an algorithm runs on an underlying census database and does projected casualties, support needed. We know how many old people, young people, we know physical structures. This is trivial to do. It doesn't cost that much money in the large scheme of things, and it's just simple algorithms running. So I think the first is create very heavy diagnostic tools. And for there, you need both underwriting in terms of financing on that, but much more the politics of that, much more the permissions of that. And that's where a lot of these entities are very good at, right? Whether it requires a collaboration with USAID and Google and Facebook and local country representatives. I don't know how the process would work out, but that's one need. I think the second thing you require in a platform to work is once you've created an underlying diagnostic structure, you need to create a structure of evaluating, the test of markets, basically, without having a market system. So how do you know an idea is winning and not winning? While I like the MCC and the discussion we had before, that still, to be honest, feels now old-fashioned to me. I feel like our ways of rapidly evaluating are not going to be some expert sitting somewhere and judging whether you met some criteria or you followed the compact. These are highly flexible, highly changing situations. So how do we create an evaluation system which is real-time, flexible, locally responsive, contextualized, and yet still faces the market test, still spreads? And I think the ultimate test is not us, to be honest, it's consumers. Like you and I should not be judging whether some product is worthwhile in education. It should be people who are buying that product and seeing value from it. How to convert that is a non-trivial thing. So I think that's the second thing. And the third to me is when you try creating a platform like that and you have a diagnostic and you have a testing tool, the third thing you need is incubation, underwriting risk. All of these efforts, for someone out there, I mean, take Kareem Lakhani has some really awesome work. His center does at HBS, which is doing these crowdsourcing, not competitions where, you have engineers come up with better solutions than NASA's solution, right? Is there an equivalent of that in our parts of the world, in developing countries? And if there is, there's a big amount of risk someone takes. Some engineer sitting and twiddling in his garage in the US and the Midwest somewhere has a different risk appetite than some small entrepreneur in a developing country. And so for me, thinking about what are the vehicles through which we will support that kind of ideation and experimentation, which is super risky and super costly, is going to be, again, a place where states, large multilaterals can come in. So that to me is the ingredients of making a platform.
Great. So I, just in the interest of time, I think I'll ask some more of the questions just so that we can try to get them in, because I think we have a little less than 10 minutes left. I think Kareem Sarhan, a fellow here at CID, had a very interesting question that COVID seems to have triggered a really big debate about welfare programs and social protection in a lot of developing countries. And so I think the question I have is, the question that is asked is, what should be in the policy debates we're having in developing countries about this response to COVID? Anyone wants to open it up to the crowd?
Maybe I can say a couple of words on this.
Yeah.
I think the questioner is to me, if anything, the COVID crisis has and the likely changes in terms of, for example, the moving away from brick and mortar stores to online shopping and things like that, and the whole the consequences for jobs and employment structure, I think suggests or it clarifies that in fact the welfare state, even in the advanced countries, isn't necessarily the right thing, because when you think about the welfare state, it's essentially two very important things. One is really about taxing and transferring to those who are less lucky. So the Nordic welfare states have very high tax rates, and then they do a lot of redistribution, a lot of social insurances to ensure that people who are hit by adverse shocks can be taken care of, whether it's unemployment insurance, family assistance, and things of that sort. That's very important for reasons of solidarity. But it treats the symptoms of a problem, not the problem itself. That is, it's taking care of what the job market and labor market disruptions are throwing into families, and saying we'll try to make you whole after the fact. The second thing that the welfare state does is insist on a lot of investments in individual and family endowments, like education, access to credit, and things like that. And that's also very important. But if underlying changes in technology and the pandemic and all of that is making sort of good productive jobs disappear, then simply preparing jobs for the labor market is not going to help them get jobs if those in the jobs are basically not there. So I think increasingly what is required, both in the advanced countries and the developing world, is actually to think that the kinds of equity or inclusion issues that the welfare state targeted are increasingly intertwined with our sort of central productive challenge of how do we create productive jobs for the majority of our labor force, and not for the kind of workforce we want to have 20 years from now if we invest adequately in education, but the workforce that we have currently. And therefore, I think that means that our sort of our development / growth agendas have to converge to some extent with our social inclusion and social policies. So that becomes more and more one and the same. I think that's a different way of thinking about how to create inclusion and growth at the same time. But that's really not how typically governments organize themselves. We have social ministries, we have, and then, we have ministries that deal with growth and investment and job creation. But those are, I think, fundamentally increasingly more and more one and the same, and I think that's really the big challenge for growth and development policy going forward.
Thank you, Dani. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask one question, and I wanted to do a roundtable of all our speakers just very, very quickly. We've talked a lot about the changing world. Dani's talked about in his lifetime of seeing growth and development changing and how we think about development changing. I've seen it in my lifetime as well, though a little younger. But I wanted to note for our students, as you're given this changing world, as a lot of our students who are here on the line are thinking about going into careers in development, and in fact, many of them, that's why they are here at the Kennedy School. If there's one short piece of advice that you would offer to the students, what would it be? And maybe we could do a roundtable. I don't know, Asim, you're laughing. I don't know if you want to start. Short though, short.
I think our students often are deeply committed to development and social impact, and I think that's awesome. But my only advice is don't always think that you find that in just development and social impact entities. I think you can find that in many places, in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, in the public sector. Frankly, sometimes in my darkest moments, I feel maybe Nestle and Unilever have done more good for reducing kind of world poverty than we development economists have by reducing the cost of consumable items. And so I think don't always, trust that you will always, given your deep desires and passions, always work for the good, no matter which sector you're in.
Great. I know, Sarah, would you like to go next?
No, I think that's an excellent point that Asim made. I think the other would be that, again, the way people think about development is very diverse. When you think about sort of, policymakers in particular who are thinking about development, they have different ideas of what that means and what the objectives should be. And so I think, certainly depending on sort of what position you end up in, but thinking about, not everybody has to be a communications professional, but thinking about, the messaging that is relevant to the audiences that you're trying to speak to, I think can be important, especially understanding that, there's a lot of heterogeneity to that and how to try to speak to different audiences and develop, to deliver a message in different kinds of ways.
Thank you. I know, Dani, you already gave us a little bit of your main advice before about that we're not going to teach you the answers. We're going to teach you how to think about the problems. Is there any other advice you would like to offer?
Read history.
That's a great one.
I think we need to have a kind of a longer term perspective and how things seem to be that seem to be normal, predictable things actually in history change. I think in terms of broadening our imagination about what's possible, I think reading history is very useful.
Great. Erin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I liked all of these. Mine is sort of more skills based, I guess, which I assume in a public policy program, this tends to be more emphasized, but the sort of like compelling, concise writing, I think is really important. Gets in a little bit to what Sarah mentioned too about knowing your audience. I think sometimes in more academic fields, the sort of a different kind of writing is prized, but being able to write a quick memo that may get your point across and does it in a way that convinces the person you're trying to convince is just pretty crucial.
Great. I'm going to offer my own advice, even though I'm the moderator as well, about being optimistic and having an open mind. I found, I think oftentimes in development, we come in with there's often, there's very much this idea of people think things are going wrong all the time and there's corruption and lots of horrible things out there. But at the same time, I feel like, at least in my career, I've met so many amazing people working in the development space who are trying to do so many wonderful things. And yes, there are constraints that they face around them, but they're trying to think creatively how to go around those constraints. And for me, I feel like I've just learned so much from them. And when I keep an open mind and I learn, oftentimes I change the way I think about things, or, I'm thinking I'm starting an evaluation of X, and then I learn so much more about the setting and learn so much more from the people around me who are entrenched in that context. And it completely changes exactly what I want to do. And so I would say to keep an optimism and to keep that open mind as you go out in the world, because there's a lot to learn from, not just here at the Kennedy School, but more broadly out in the world. And on that note, so I wanted to first, I've loved this panel. So I wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate everybody, both in the audience and here in the panel, for taking your time out of your day to be here with us and to share your insights. And then I've been told that I should also inform everybody to join us next time, Friday, April 9th, for our next CID speaker series with Priya Darshani Joshi, the Senior Research Project Officer for the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report. She will speak on the effects of COVID-19 on education systems. And so that also seems like an incredibly important and interesting talk. And so I hope everybody could also join us then as well. And thank you.